More than 90,000 Canadian families live in housing co-ops. Some choose cooperative living because they like the sense of community. Other people appreciate the opportunity to shape the future of the place where they live. And government assistance has allowed co-ops to build mixed-income communities. Recently, the co-op housing sector has had to face some tough challenges. That was the subject of the CHF Canada's first electronic town hall, held at its annual general meeting in London, Ontario. Linked by the internet, delegates from the floor and from across the country were invited to help answer the question, how do we size up our future? Scale and size are important concepts, especially these days when there often isn't enough money to go around. Efficiency is more important than ever. But what are the trade-offs? Small co-ops are more expensive to run, so mergers can look like a good idea. But some people fear that the closeness of a small community will be lost if a co-op is too big. And questions of scale aren't just relevant to individual housing co-ops. It's also an important issue to federations and other organizations that lobby government, provide advice and direction to co-ops, and organize important events, like this annual general meeting.
Scale is not one solution. It's not a solution to be pursued. I think it's a very broad term that encompasses a dozen potential strategies that we can follow. Some people mention strategic partnerships, other people mention mergers, other people mention group buying programs. There are any number of strategies that would fall under the general rubric of harnessing the power of scale for housing co-ops and the co-op housing sectors.
Before they went to the floor and to the internet for answers, the town hall meeting went halfway around the world to see what could be learned from the co-op housing sector in the land down under.
Let's go to the space station. Okay, that's us. A few small co-ops dotted around there. Oh. That's Australia, and we're going to go down into Melbourne, and we are going to welcome our guests from Australia. Good morning or good evening.
Thank you, Nicholas, and welcome. It's great to be able to join you this morning or this evening here. Certainly we've been watching with great interest. There's over 100 cooperatives here in Victoria, in the state. They're relatively small, ranging from 10 to houses up to about 50 properties. So in terms of, they're all relatively small. But the difference is that all the properties are owned by this central company, Common Equity, and there's nearly 2,000 dwellings at the moment. And the combined value is about $450 million.
What do your members say?
Oh, we're a bunch of cooperatives. It's a wide and varied pool of thought. But by and large, most cooperatives absolutely see the benefit of having the company there. It is a partnership relationship. We don't exist without them, and vice versa. Co-op members would by and large say Common Equity is pretty good because it keeps its nose out of our business, but when we do need a helping hand, they're certainly there and reach out to us. And as John's alluded to, we've wanted to grow. Some of us have wanted to grow a bit in the last decade or so, but there were certainly some barriers to that. Having the company there, and for all the reasons that John's just spoken about, has enabled us some growth for the first time in a very long time, and that's exciting.
The questions from the floor were of a practical nature. Participants asked how cooperative housing works in Australia, how to ensure that co-op housing remains affordable, how mergers affect existing cooperatives, and the relationship of the co-op federations to the various levels of government. Then, saying goodbye to Karen and John, the delegates applied their newfound knowledge to the Canadian context by coming up with their own answers to a series of questions. How confident are you about the future of co-op housing in Canada?
My question about, or my thoughts for the session today is just to keep in perspective, maybe when we're talking about size and successful future, to start incorporating thoughts about development of future housing cooperatives as well.
We have rent geared to income. I have no fear for the future of our co-op, but I really don't know how we're going to accommodate. You talk about affordable housing. In Toronto, affordable housing is 80% of market rate, and the average person, worker, cannot afford that.
I think that one of the things around this sort of thing that we need to really look at is the question of the effectiveness of the regional federations. I think that that's a core piece here.
Seems like Vancouver, we have a little bit more success rate as for how we're doing than individuals in other parts of the country. But I'm really worried that as a cohesive unit that there's going to be a domino effect, especially on Ontario, if it seems to be an erosion, then it's going to affect all of us. And so if we're going to have some sort of a scaling effect, is it going to be one size fits all?
We've struggled as a whole as CHF to deal with our federal government, never mind our provincial governments. And so we need to look at another way to keep our co-ops viable.
Next, the delegates shared some ideas about what they thought were the advantages and disadvantages of the organizational structure as it is now.
The co-op movement, as mine historically, has always been a grassroots sort of organization, and I think at this time our structure does respond to that need for individuals to feel connected to their community.
I think one of the advantages is autonomy for under our present structure.
One of the advantages is that we're quickly able to react to issues in our own community, our own members.
One of our advantages is our individuality.
Housing owned by the residents?
A sense of community. I know almost everybody who lives in my co-op because we're not hundreds and hundreds of units.
Ability in the past to influence the design of our co-ops when we were able to build.
One of the problems for some of the smaller co-ops is the ability to actually pay for the long-term capital and maintenance costs. Under a certain size, you cannot keep the costs affordable and still repair the elevator, repair the balconies, repair the underground parking. If you're under 100 units, it becomes very, very hard to keep the housing affordable and meet the physical building obligations.
I believe sometimes one of the disadvantages is that members set the housing charges, because sometimes if they keep them artificially low, then that's when our maintenance problems and all of those other problems arise, because I think the emphasis sometimes is on the low housing charges instead of paying enough to make sure that we can afford professional maintenance services when we need them.
I think there's almost across the board in small and large housing co-ops, there's a significant duplication of costs, especially around professional, in the professional area, whether it comes to audits, lawyers, engineers, architectural consulting. It could be done far more rationally and far more cost effectively if it was done on a larger scale.
One of the disadvantages would be if you have a small unit, I come from a 12-unit co-op, would be a vacancy. Could get your co-op in a lot of trouble.
I'm one of many of us, I suspect, who found a great sense of stability by moving into a housing co-op, a sense of stable housing, no fear of being tossed out by arbitrary real estate interests. And yet, as a small co-op of 26 units, we now operate as a group in a relatively unstable situation where we're concerned about our future finances, concerned about our building envelope problems, all kinds of things that put us on the knife edge of possible survival and possible financial difficulty.
One of the advantages of autonomy is we have too many co-ops that are isolated from the sector. And this really creates problems for potential co-ops when they get into difficulty. They don't get the help that they need. They basically don't practice the co-op principle of cooperation among cooperatives. So, and there's just too many of those.
The hot topic of mergers brought the discussion to the North End Housing Co-op in Halifax, where several cooperatives recently merged.
The first thing that was gained was the co-ops themselves were saved. Okay. And there were 131 households that were able to retain co-op status. And it did bring together their resources and allowed them to come together with a singular plan to move forward to the future. They were not all that different. They were in a downtown community, very urban setting, very similar cultures and mixes of people, and they actually knew each other. They thought of themselves as being part of a larger community, in their own neighborhoods, part of a larger community. And so there wasn't that kind of pressure of we're losing our identity. Everybody kept their own neighborhood name, and they'll have signs. that will help them retain the memories of those neighborhoods. But now they have one set of directors. As you're right, only one audit, if we can ever get it complete.
With the merger complete and a solid foundation in place, the combined co-op is looking toward a brighter future.
And we are planning for the future. We have a maintenance reserve, which is now being funded every single month from revenue coming in. We now have a singular process for attracting new members. And by the end of this year, we're going to be full. We were experiencing a lot of vacancies. The units were in really bad shape, and we couldn't afford to fix them up. Now we're going through a huge renovation process. We're redoing all of the units, and they'll be more environmentally efficient, more attractive, and more long-lasting, and we'll have a waiting list.
Mergers are just one example of how co-ops can be restructured to become more efficient, which brought town hall participants to a crucial question. How can the sector harness the power of scale to make co-ops healthier and stronger organizations?
And I think we sit around our staff association table saying, geez, wouldn't it be really nice if we had an investment specialist somewhere in the Federation? Wouldn't it be nice to have someone who can help us develop tendering documents for when we have to get major projects done? So I see the benefit of the using the scale approach to getting these services done at reduced costs. I just don't know what it's going to look like.
From Co-op La Fontaine, we have 4. Representation for government funding, the growth and building of new affordable housing, a means to have a louder voice. They also suggest the development of worker co-ops, smiley face, to help fill the gaps of services and needs of co-ops. They also have one that says Co-op Principle 7, cooperation amongst cooperatives.
You know, I think there's probably a lot of things that people feel comfortable talking about on the smaller level, maybe about putting co-ops together, which, you know what, I think you can actually do quite easily. Groups locally can work together on that. There's advantages in cooperation. But I really think if we don't look at the bigger picture, all we're doing is Band-Aid solutions.
I appreciated the way we started the discussion here today. I particularly enjoyed the input from our friends in Australia and the fact that they can do development with 2,000 units and it just makes me totally envious. I'm very, very positive about the whole process. So let's get going and carry on the discussion, get as many people involved as we can, and hopefully do some good work for our membership.